Hey, what are you drinking?
Hey, kombucha.
It says Synergy on the bottle.
Yeah, it's helps me synergize. Do you like kombucha?
I have no idea what kombucha is.
Welcome to the 5th episode of FemgineerTV, brought to you by Pivotal Tracker. I'm your host, Purnima Vijay Shankar, the founder of Femgineer. Femgineer is an education company where we teach innovators how to build software products so they can find freedom in their careers, enrich other people's lives, and make the tech community a lot more inclusive and flexible. Back in episode 2 of FemgineerTV, we had special guest Jocelyn Goldfein, the former director of engineering at Facebook. Jocelyn and I were talking about how to make smart trade-offs when building software products. And we talked about the importance of looking at the tech stack as well as the business model before deciding on how to make a trade-off. Now, that episode might have given you some great insights into how to make decisions from a very, very high level, but you probably were left wondering what to do on a day-to-day basis. How do you prioritize all the various activities that are vying for your attention? So today on FemgineerTV, we're going to be tackling your to-do list. If you're an engineer or a designer, then your days are probably filled with a myriad of to-dos, such as product launches, bug fixes, answering emails, debugging issues, interviewing candidates, and so on and so on. And you're probably left wondering if the work that you're doing is actually making a big impact. While it's easy for other people to tell us that we just need to work smarter, not harder, the bulk of the work falls on our shoulders. And oftentimes the only way we can get it all done is by actually putting in more hours. To help us identify efforts that are going to make a big impact and produce results, I've invited our special guest today, Edmond Lau, who is the author of the newest book, The Effective Engineer. Edmond has worked at large companies like Google, as well as growth stage startups like Ooyala, Quora, and most recently, Quip. Hey Edmond, thanks for joining us today.
Hey Purnima, glad to be here.
Thanks. So congratulations on the launch of your new book, The Effective Engineer.
Thanks.
Yeah. Before we dig into your work, I want to just start by asking you, what got you into writing?
Yeah, so I first started writing, I think, soon after I joined Quora. Quora was a question and answer site where a lot of people were asking questions about how do I sort of get the most out of my engineering job? How do I sort of have a larger impact on what I'm doing? And people were just asking for lots of advice. And when I started answering questions, I found that a lot of people were really excited that there was some advice that they could get on the web. And that felt really rewarding to me. So that sort of got me on the path to basically start writing. And then sort of specifically focusing on engineering writing, one thing that I did while I was at Quora was build out the onboarding and mentoring program for new engineers. Because there's a lot of lessons that more senior engineers learn through years and years of experience and years of trial and effort that a lot of the newer engineers simply didn't know. And so what we found was that by just investing a little bit of work in the beginning, we could really sort of change the trajectory of a lot of these newer engineers. And so sort of writing about engineering topics and writing about how to be a more effective engineer was sort of an extension of just doing onboarding for Quora's engineers. With writing, I'm able to basically reach a much larger audience and sort of share some of the same lessons, stories, and advice that new engineers at Quora found helpful, but except at a larger scale.
There must have been a lot of work to balance writing code and writing the book. How did you get it all done?
Yeah, it's my first book, so I didn't really know what I was doing when I first started. I definitely asked a lot of people who had written books before to get some of their advice. But when I first started writing the book, I actually took a personal sabbatical and took 10 months off to basically focus purely on the book. And I would, sort of sit down every day, set a goal for myself. Initially, it was write 1,000 words per day. And I wouldn't stop until I hit my 1,000 words. And so by setting that sort of consistent habit, day over day, I was able to actually produce a manuscript. And so that was part of a really exciting part of just writing the book.
Well, kudos to you for creating the book. I've definitely enjoyed reading it because I think it does a really good job of capturing all the things I've learned of building software products for the last 10 years. And in today's episode, I want to share a number of the strategies that you actually talk about in the book. And I know one of the big goals is obviously to be effective at what you do, but to also translate that into making a big impact and creating results. For our viewers, they might have a sense of what a big impact means to them, but for the purposes of our conversation, I'd like to come up with like a definition or a context by what we mean about big impact and results. So let's start there. What exactly does that mean?
Sure. I think when people talk about impact and they talk about sort of the value that they're adding, it's usually in the context of one of two things. One is impact and value that you're producing for the organization that you're working at. So that might be, customers added. It might be products built. It might be, if you are doing rentals or like rent nights booked or like rides booked, etc. The other side of impact is impact on the team. So how much value are you adding toward the team of people that you're actually working with? And so usually when we sort of talk about impact, it's sort of in the context of one of those two things.
Okay, so one of the goals of this show is to do some myth busting. And one of the common myths that I see time and time again is when people think that they only need to focus on their technical skills. And they put a lot of importance into improving how they code, learning new languages, etc. And I think a lot of this originates from engineering school, where we're taught how to build something. We're taught that it's important to think about new languages and new frameworks, etc. But a lot of times that can be ineffective, and we should take the time to figure out whether something should be built or should not be built. So can you elaborate on why it's important to think about the why something should or should not be built versus the how?
Like when I first left Google to sort of join the startup world, I thought to myself, okay, I really want this startup to succeed. We're an underdog, and that means that we have to work really, really hard if we're actually to do well. And so, I had a mindset of, okay, I'm going to work 70 to 80 hour weeks. I'm just going to power through everything. My team thought the same way. And we thought that, okay, if we just worked really hard, then, we're going to maximize the chances that our startup will actually do well. And it took me a while to sort of start really questioning that idea. And in fact, there were a few sort of instances where I really started asking myself, is working 70, 80 hour weeks, is that really the best strategy for helping our startup succeed? There was an analytics module that a video startup I worked at built for a customer. We spent maybe about 2-3 weeks building it, but the customer never even used it. And it was clear that any sort of technical decision that sort of went into building the analytics module ultimately had no impact. It really didn't matter. We could have skipped that 2 to 3 weeks worth of work, and we'd be the same place we were before. There's another case where we built a bunch of content management tools, and it just never got the user adoption that we wanted. There was a time where I was on vacation and hiking around volcanoes in Hawaii, and then I got paged. Was that really sort of the best usage of my time? Was sort of like thinking about work all the time really sort of the best strategy? And it really took me sort of many years of like trial and error to realize that it's not really about how many hours you work or how hard you work. What you're working on also matters. And so the decision of like where to actually spend your time is actually really critical in terms of determining your impact, and maybe perhaps much more critical than the actual technical work that you're producing.
Got it. Okay, so we know that we can't just focus on technical work. We need to do some other things. But oftentimes we get stuck doing a lot of busy work, right? We sit in meetings, we write emails, we have to debug issues and fight fires, and we have all these things going on. And oftentimes we also have to build new product features that you said, for example, may or may not actually take off. And so that can get really tricky when we have all these other tasks. And then to make matters worse, a lot of times we have to appeal to management requests or other departments. And what I've seen a lot of times is engineers will just drop everything that they're doing to satisfy some of those requests. And it's hard to say no to those people. So myth number 2 is a lot of times people feel like they need to drop everything and answer either a management or another department's request rather than staying focused on their tasks and what they're doing. So how do you address that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not really, a lot of times when a manager or a product manager sort of asks you to do something, they have a lot of things going on. They have a lot of priorities that they're juggling. And so they're not really sort of aware of all the priorities that are on your own plate. And so that's why it's important for you as like an engineer or a product designer to sort of think through priorities yourself. Not all the work that you're going to do is really created equal, right? There's a lot of well-intentioned work, like sort of the work that I did when I first joined the startup community that really didn't have much of an impact. And so you have to be very conscientious about where you're spending your time. And so one sort of really useful framework for thinking about impact and work and sort of where you should be spending your time is this concept of leverage. And so leverage is a concept that I cover a lot in my book, The Effective Engineer. And what leverage basically means is it's the amount of impact that you're producing per unit of time that you're investing in something. And so you can also think about it as the 80-20 rule. Is there something that you can do that only takes 20% of the effort, but that generates 80% of the results? And the reason why leverage is so important for engineering or sort of building products is because we all have a very finite amount of time. There's only so many hours during the work week. And if you can sort of focus on the highest leverage activities, that ensures that you're going to be producing as much impact as you can with the limited amount of time that you have. And so when you're sort of thinking about what to work on, how to prioritize, you really just be thinking about for every minute or hour that I'm going to be putting in this activity, how much impact can I generate? How does that compare with the leverage of other activities? And so that's sort of where you should start about thinking about priorities.
Okay, so we know that we have to do some high-level thinking and sit down and look at our tasks and prioritize them before we get down to work. But for our viewers out there, they might not yet be familiar with what that 20% of work is that's going to generate 80% of the results. So how do we need to be thinking about our tasks? How do we comb through them?
And so we know that leverage is impact produced per unit time. And so one way to think about it is, consider any activity that you're trying to do. If you want to increase your leverage, you can basically ask yourself a few questions. You can ask yourself, is there a way to get this activity done faster? Because if you can decrease the amount of time it takes, then you're producing more impact for less time spent on that activity. You can ask yourself, is there a way to basically generate more value out of the same activity? Or you can ask yourself, is there something else that you could be doing entirely different that would have higher leverage? And so just to walk through a few examples, maybe you have a hour-long meeting that you're scheduled to discuss a design. You can think through these 3 questions. Is there a way that we can shorten this meeting? Can we just hold a half-hour meeting instead of an hour-long meeting? That would sort of increase the leverage of the meeting. You can think about, can I come up with an agenda beforehand that I can send to all the meeting attendees? That way, like during the actual meeting itself, you're able to produce a lot more value and focused on the things that you actually care about. But you can also, take it a step further. Maybe you can avoid the meeting entirely.
That's my favorite.
Yeah. Maybe you can just, write up a small design doc, send it around, and then just get feedback. And maybe that just ends up saving a lot more time while also getting most of the value that you want. Or take another example. Maybe you're working on improving the performance of a product. You can sort of think about it as, can I do that faster? Can I learn some type of profiling tool so that I can identify the bottlenecks in less time and fix them more quickly? You can try to see if you can increase the impact of the activity. So you ask yourself, of all the web pages that are in my application, which ones get the most traffic. Prioritize those web pages first when you're trying to improve performance. That way, sort of any work that you put into performance improvements impacts a larger percentage of people. But you can also go a step further. Maybe you can even just sort of build a culture with the team where everyone considers performance as a feature and not just something that you tack on at the end. So you sort of give everyone the tools and the sort of mindset necessary to really sort of address performance as you're building products, as you're building features. And perhaps that can sort of save you from having to investigate those performance issues in the first place. And so in any sort of activity, you can basically ask yourself those 3 questions to try to shift the leverage of that activity to something higher.
Nice. So it's a combination of process and tools, and especially like what you said about the meetings, because BusyBee, my previous startup, we actually got rid of all of our meetings.
That's great.
And we would have maybe daily stand-ups, and then we did postmortems every quarter, which was great. But then in between, we had asynchronous communication, which was basically having a chat. And now a lot of people use Slack. So it was kind of the precursor to Slack, where we would just put messages for people and we would @ them so they knew that the message was for them. But we also set a standard, like you were suggesting, of we shouldn't have things that are on fire, because that means we've done something wrong engineering-wise. Like there shouldn't be something where people have to get constantly interrupted to take a meeting or to resolve an issue, and the asynchronous communication should just smooth all of that out. But more importantly, we have good process of doing test-driven development and these things where we're not having to interrupt people. So
yeah. I mean, even right now at Quip, like we really only have like one sort of standing engineering meeting a week, and in sort of the same way that it sounds like you did at BusyBee. Anything that we will sort of, any decisions we will have to make, typically an engineer will just write a design doc and sort of share it on Quip with the team. And we'll just do a lot of chat, like on Quip chat, basically tackle any issues or answer any questions or do any sort of short discussions. And we use that in place of meetings, and that's worked out really well.
Yeah, so you're also dog fooding your product.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. So I'm a big fan of building internal tools to save time, especially for those recurring tasks, but I will take the time to make sure that I evaluate whether there's already a tool that exists in the market, and then pay the $10 or even $100 a month to use that and integrate it into our product. But I know a lot of people just sort of jump right in and start building when they might have done a better job of just buying something or even holding off. How do you get people to think about when's the right time to build? Any suggestions?
Yeah, I would say like the mindset of investing in a tool, that question that you're asking yourself is already a really good question, because automation is a very high leverage activity, right? You do it once and then it takes care of itself going forward. And so you don't have to spend, hopefully any time sort of maintaining this going forward. In terms of when you should be automating something, I would say that engineers in general tend to under-automate. It's partly because we underestimate a lot of times sort of how often we'll have to do something manually.
Right.
And so we think, we're just going to do this once. But then, some requirements change and you basically have to end up doing something manually again. And so there's a tendency to basically under invest in tooling. Another reason is because automation is also a skill, and so the more that you automate, the easier it becomes.
Right.
And so if we aren't used to doing automation, we can sort of bias toward just doing things manually because it's comfortable, because we sort of are confident that we can get it done with a fixed amount of time. A better way to think about it is to actually do the math, right? Like, maybe there's a server that crashes and it takes you 3 hours every week to get it back up and running and make sure everything's okay. If you can build a tool that maybe takes you say 12 hours to automate it, that means that after a month you've sort of paid off that cost, that investment that you've made. And anything going forward is just like pure gains. And so sort of doing that math is really important. Another rule of thumb that I learned when I was talking with Rafi Krikorian, who was a former VP of engineering at Twitter, was that he used to tell his team that anytime you do something manually for the third time, that's probably a time that you should really just consider automating it or writing a tool. And so I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. If you notice yourself doing something multiple times, you should pause. You should think about, is there a way that I can automate what I'm doing?
Yeah.
If it takes a lot of work to automate, you can also think about, will learning to automate this thing help me be more efficient automating in the future? Because that's also a benefit that a lot of people overlook.
Right.
And so I think starting there is probably a good, that's probably a good starting point.
Yeah. I've also noticed if you do that amortization math and you tell it to, say, somebody who's mostly like business focused, then they actually get it.
Yeah.
Because they're like, oh, okay, it makes sense. But if you're just like, oh, I have to do this thing, they're like, why is that important, right? So I think it's valuable for yourself, but it's also valuable if you're trying to prioritize and get somebody to give you time to do the work.
Right.
Because a lot of times you might have some level of pushback. So yeah, I think that's a great technique.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I mean, in communicating with especially non-technical members of the team, if you can translate your work into quantifiable impact, maybe like some business metric that your team understands, or if you could translate it into actual hours, that sort of becomes this really useful language that you can use for non-technical members of the team. They might not understand the engineering that needs to go into it. They might not understand sort of why, automation might be hard or not hard, but if you can quantify it as, this is the impact that it's going to have, this is how long it's going to take, then they can also basically do that math and sort of align their interests, or sort of align their thinking with what you've been thinking.
Got it. Now, it's also really easy as we start to build these tools and develop a level of confidence that we just have to keep tweaking and perfecting our code and building tools. And a lot of times people will halt themselves from actually pushing it out because they're like, oh, I just have to add one more thing and one more thing. So how do we convince people to push forward and iterate rather than trying to get everything done and then doing a deployment or pushing it out?
I think it's important to focus on the goal that you might have. So if you are building a new version of product, then your goal is probably to learn as much as possible in a short amount of time. And in that case, what you want to do is you want to make choices and make decisions that help you get feedback from users sooner. And so that might mean you do things in a more iterative fashion. So you build something, you release it to some users, you get some data, you get some qualitative feedback or quantitative feedback, and then you use that information to then build the next iteration of the product. If instead you're building a product that's already sort of fairly well established, then very likely there's already some metric that you're using to judge the success of that product. Maybe it's weekly active users, maybe it's revenue that's being collected from customers. And in that case, you should really be sort of making decisions and trade-offs that help you to increase that metric more rapidly. And so you can, sort of do experiments. Like, do you sort of increase that metric more when you focus on launching new features that your customers may want? Or are you able to increase that metric more by just doing small iterations? And you can, experiment with both. Maybe spend a month doing iteration, spend a month building a new feature, and sort of see which approach gets you more leverage in terms of increasing that core business metric. And so really it just depends on the goal that you have, and then collecting data to see sort of which avenue best helps you achieve that goal.
So we've talked about leverage, and you mention it in your book. And I think it's a great concept, both personally, thinking about how can you create leverage from your activities, but it's also important in terms of the team's effort. And in the book, you bring up two great examples of leverage activities, at least my two favorite, which are onboarding as well as mentoring new hires. And you gave an example of how you did it at Quora at a time where you had to bring on a lot of employees at once. But unfortunately, I think Quora is probably one of the companies that are in the minority when it comes to making the investment in terms of onboarding and mentoring employees. So can you share with us what were the results of doing this investment? Like, what did you see in terms of impact? Sure.
And I think it would probably also helpful just to cover some of the mindset and rationale of what went into that onboarding. I mean, sort of the average engineer over a course of a year probably puts in around 2,000 hours of work if you consider the average 40-hour work week. 2,000 hours is a lot of hours, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of output that you can create during there's 2,000 hours. So does doing some investment in onboarding and mentoring, does that make sense? Well, if you spent, say, an hour a day for a new hire's first month, that's really only 20 hours, right? That's only 1% of sort of the new hire's time for that entire year. And yet those 20 hours can make a huge impact on what that new hire ends up doing. If you can sort of get them to pick up best practices, or if you can get them to figure out how the organization or the processes or the culture works, that new hire can be a lot more effective. And it might seem that, okay, building this program is a huge investment. How do you sort of justify that to managers or justify it to the rest of the team?
Yeah, I've in fact heard from VPs who have said, oh, if the developer shows up on the first day and can't get set up, then they're probably a bad hire. So a lot of times it's hard to justify. So yeah, how would you justify it? Right.
And I think the important thing to realize is that onboarding and mentoring doesn't have to be this binary variable, right? It's not, okay, we have onboarding or mentoring or we don't, right? It's a very incremental process.
I see.
For instance, when I first joined Quip, there wasn't really much in terms of onboarding, and so one of the first things I did was I just started a doc. That doc had, what are all the things that I did during my first day or first few days to get set up. These are helpful resources. These are links that you might consider reading. And so by just making that small little investment, probably only took me an hour or two. The next new hire was then able to ramp up a lot more quickly.
Right.
And so that was a pretty high leverage activity for the team. And moreover, by just sort of having that small doc, newer hires could then add to it. People can sort of build upon that. And so it really only just takes a little bit amount of effort to really get started. And from that, you can sort of iterate. Would it be helpful to have more tutorials or more docs available to more new hires? Would it be helpful to have some sort of onboarding talks? And so over time, you can sort of build up a more full-fledged program, but all it has to start with is just one small doc.
Yeah.
Now, you also had a question about sort of what were the results? What does it actually accomplish? And so, at Quora, we sort of ended up having a series of documents called code labs. So that's an idea that I borrowed from Google. It's a code lab is basically a document that walks over a core abstraction of the company. It talks about why does this abstraction exist? How do we go about building it? What are the relevant pieces of the code that you should look over to really understand how this core abstraction works? And then also had a few exercises to validate your understanding. And so at Quora, we had maybe around 10 code labs that the engineering team had written up. And we also had roughly 10 onboarding talks that every new hire goes through that really sort of taught them how the engineering team works, what the expected best practices were, what sort of the quality standards were, et cetera. And sort of the end result of that type of onboarding, plus sort of assigning them a mentor, was that in a new hire's first day, they were able to make a change to the code that they were able to push production.
Nice.
It was something simple as adding themselves to a team page. But then in the first week, most of the new hires were then able to also do some meaningful bug fix or implement some meaningful small feature. And that's something that we've been able to do at Quip as well. And at Quip, the onboarding program is much smaller because it's a much smaller company. But with that sort of onboarding new hire doc, new hires are able to typically push some to production in their first week as well. And so that really just sort of helps to set the tone of, you can get ramped up quickly.
Right.
And we expect you to ramp up quickly. And we'll also sort of give you the tools that you need to sort of make meaningful changes to the code base and to the product, even in your first week.
Probably helps with employee retention too.
Yeah,
right.
You're giving them a lot more excited when they can actually ship something right after they join.
Yeah, so it's giving them that positive first-time experience, just like you would with a customer when they're coming to your product for the first time.
Exactly.
Yeah, nice. So onboarding and mentoring employees is great. It's a high leverage activity and it gets everybody on the same page in terms of best practices. But what do you do in the instances where you are dependent on someone else? You're just stuck and you can't move forward, or maybe they're stuck and they can't move forward. How do you resolve that situation?
Yeah, I think in any optimization problem, I think the first step is figure out what your bottleneck is, right? Is this dependency the bottleneck, or is it something that you can just sort of go off and work on, do your other work for other projects while you're sort of waiting for this person to complete that dependency? If that's the case, then maybe you should focus on something else instead. If that's not the case, then sort of the next step is figuring out, are they bottlenecked and blocked on? Are they bottlenecked on this issue because it's not a priority for them? So sometimes, you might be working on a part of the product. You might depend on this library being built or this server having some feature, and it's really important to you.
Right.
But it might not be at the top of their priority list.
Right.
And so having some initial conversation with them to make sure that your priorities are aligned is sort of the first step. Make sure that they understand sort of where your priorities are and sort of what's important to you, and also sort of understand what their priorities are and what's important to them. If it was just sort of some miscommunication, then sometimes that conversation can help resolve it. But otherwise, it might also be the case that what's sort of most important for your team is not necessarily what's most important for their team.
Yeah.
And in that case, you have a few options. One is maybe you ask this person to actually ramp you up on their part of the code base so that you can actually make that change. And granted, it might take you more time than someone on that team to sort of make that change.
Right.
But if this is the bottleneck for your project, then it could still be extremely high leverage for you to basically learn that code base sufficiently such that you can go in yourself and make that change. And maybe that's the right solution.
Yeah, I've actually talked about this with designers and developers because the designer will be like, I need time to make this, look good, and the developer will be like, okay, but I just need to see something like basic so that I could start to figure out where to do the layout and all of that. And I actually met a designer, I believe it was either at Square or somewhere else, where they said, I'll work on perfecting it, but then I'll just give them some rudimentary files that they can go off and get what they need to done, so that it's not that sort of bottleneck. Do you have other examples like that?
Yeah, I think another, so sometimes people ask me sort of what are the best skills I should be focusing on learning. And sort of your example sort of reminded me that sometimes I would tell them that it's really useful to sort of pick up basic skills in adjacent disciplines.
Yeah.
So for instance, I do a lot of work on user growth. And so just knowing some amount of like minimal UI design or knowing sort of some amount of copy editing can really go pretty far in terms of having a product or a prototype that that feels good. If you're a front-end engineer, learning some amount of how to run your own servers can be pretty useful. Knowing some product management skills would also sort of be part of the adjacent disciplines for a front-end engineer. If you're someone who's working on server-side code, maybe learning some machine learning, or maybe learning some sort of minimal front-end design skills should be pretty useful for your job. And so I think considering adjacent disciplines is sort of one useful way to think about it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty highly leverageable activity as well. I remember I primarily am a back-end engineer, and I remember when I first had to learn CSS and HTML, or actually just CSS, I didn't enjoy it, but when I figured out just a little bit, then I could very quickly go in and debug issues. But prior to that, I was just always tapping on my front-end engineer's desk, being like, I don't know how to do this. And then finally he got frustrated, I got frustrated, and then just decided to resolve it by learning just a little bit.
Yeah.
And it actually made the whole process go a lot smoother.
Yeah, that's actually very common.
Yeah.
Like, a little bit of knowledge can make you pretty dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely wasn't good enough to do the work on my own, but it got us moving past. And then in return, I also taught him just a little bit to get him off the ground when it came to like database design, and that way we weren't always working in a way that was getting the other person stuck.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's really valuable.
That's great.
Cool. Okay, so final question for you. What would you recommend that our viewers do in terms of just 1 to 2 simple steps that would get them off on the right track?
Yeah, I think one great way to get started is just to find people who have done it before, right? One of the reasons why mentoring and onboarding worked really well was because it took all this knowledge from some of the more senior engineers and passed that knowledge to some of the newer hires. And so that's something that I've tried to do when I was basically spending those 2 years writing my book. Was I went around Silicon Valley and I interviewed a lot of engineering leaders, people like Bobby Johnson, who used to be a director of engineering at Facebook, or Mark Hedlund, who's the VP of engineering at Stripe, and a bunch of people from Google, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. And the reason I did that was because these people have a lot of knowledge, a lot of stories, a lot of lessons that they learned over many years of trial and error. And if we can sort of distill some of those stories and distill some of those themes and those lessons, we can save ourselves a lot of time. And so I found it to be extremely high leverage just to sort of figure out, what are the patterns that we see from other engineering leaders? What are the top mistakes that they make? And so that's what I spent those 2 years trying to distill into my book. And I think through that book, you'll learn a lot about leverage, which we started talking about in today's session. And you also learn about how to apply the principle of leverage to basically everything you do as an engineer, whether it's figuring out metrics, whether it's prioritizing what to do next, whether it's maintaining the quality of your code base, estimating sort of how long projects take to do. And so, if this is something that you're interested in, that I think sort of learning those lessons from some of the sort of best engineering leaders in Silicon Valley is a great way to start.
So I really enjoyed reading your book, The Effective Engineer, and I think it was a great way to distill, one, a lot of the strategies that I had learned over time, but two, also to read other people's stories of how they went about building products and teams. For our viewers, can you tell us what are maybe 1 to 2 ways in which they would benefit from picking up a copy of your book and reading it?
So like I said sort of at the beginning, when I first started working at startups, I had this misconception that the more hours I worked, the higher the impact I could produce. But that's really not the case. A lot of times we'll do work that doesn't necessarily lead to impact. And so one of the core things that the book would teach you is this framework of leverage that you can use to identify what are the actual efforts that will lead to a disproportionate impact. Where are the places where you can spend your time so that you're not just wasting it, but instead producing value for the product, for the team, and also for yourself and your career. Another of the things that I learned when I was just going around Silicon Valley and interviewing engineering leaders to get their stories, their lessons, and their mistakes is that all of these skills that help the best engineers be effective, they're all learnable. They're not magical things that are sort of out of everyone's grasp. There are very basic frameworks and mindsets that we can adopt to begin thinking how the most effective engineers think. Yeah, what the book will teach you is it'll help you identify, where are the efforts you should be spending to achieve significantly more value for your team and for yourself, but with fewer hours of work.
Just to quickly recap, we covered 3 things. The first thing we covered was that it's not enough to just have technical chops. We also need to work on improving how we focus and where we spend our time. The second is that we might have a very, very long to-do list, but we need to take the time to prioritize that and figure out what are the activities that are actually going to make a difference, have an impact, and produce results. And the third is thinking about leverage. How can we pursue activities that will create leverage for ourselves as well as our teams? And the two examples that we gave you were onboarding and mentoring new hires. The benefit of making the investment initially is that they come up to speed really quickly. You oftentimes retain them as employees. And beyond that, your entire team is productive and happy and shipping product. Thanks again to our special guest, Edmond Lau, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, to all of you out there, our viewers, and our sponsor, Pivotal Tracker, for helping us in producing this episode of FemgineerTV. Subscribe to Femgineer's YouTube channel to receive the next episode, where we'll have special guests, the founders of Pop-Up Archive, Ann Wooten and Bailey Smith. And if you've enjoyed this episode, then please share it with your friends, your teammates, and your boss, and let us know in the blog comments below what was your favorite part about this episode. I'm looking forward to reading your comments. This episode of FemgineerTV is brought to you by Pivotal Tracker. Build better software faster. Check out Edmond Lau's latest book, The Effective Engineer. Visit theeffectiveengineer.com/book. What is that? What are you drinking?
Looks like you're drinking Mission in a bottle.
Yeah, that's good.
Have heated.
Get out of here. Just going with it. Alright. I say this all the time, but I always say it wrong. No matter how many times I say it. Well, I can't think of how else I should end it.
Ship it.
Yeah!